we are going to be getting right into the main topic tonight of how to encourage role playing in your games. I know for myself, I run a few different groups. I have some groups that role play is just a natural part of what those people do. They are extroverted. They want to do it, and they just seemingly naturally do it. And then I have other groups where it requires a little bit of finessing and a little bit of massaging as the dungeon master to kind of bring it out of them. And so I want to start with this question because we're going to try and move from maybe the negative toward the positive, okay? Is in your experiences as a dungeon master, why do people hesitate to roleplay? Todd, why do you find that people hesitate in the first place when it comes to roleplaying?
The people that I've seen like that, they typically have some form of stage fright, where they're like, okay, I don't want to perform, I just want to roll dice and smash things. And a lot of that comes from a very video game sort of mentality, where you can go through the dialogue options, but the dialogue options are, they are defined trees. But with role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, there's no defined tree. You can literally do anything you want, or at least try, and that paralysis of too much choice for a lot of people.
Yeah, in my experience, honestly, being a little bit newer, I don't have quite the experience these folks do, but some people seem to slip into roleplay a little bit easier sometimes when you are playing via Discord, because like he mentioned with the stage fright, throwing a funny accent or whatever it may be that you use to immerse yourself into it can make you feel a little out of your comfort zone. And sometimes, the right group can really help bring that out. But if they're the first one to go or they're still really new to it causes that stage fright hesitation. Absolutely.
I think it's going to make a big difference depending on if you're playing with people that you know, as opposed to I found a group online that I'm joining, and maybe an added layer of and that group is streaming. Now what do I do? Kind of thing.
Yeah, I had a thought about that though. Is the vulnerability that it takes to create a character that you really care about and then to step into those shoes, I think is part of it as well. That when you create a character with an awesome backstory and you love it and you've fallen in love with this character already, at least that's when I build characters, that's the way I always feel. It can be a little scary to make that first step into being that character for 2 hours, or 3 hours or 5 hours, depending on how you play. So for me, that's always been it's kind of like stage fright, but it's more psychological. It's not the performance; it's the idea that I'm going to be making decisions for this person, and it's not going to live in my head anymore, and that's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. In last week's episode, we talked about character bleed, and the connection, and also the important disconnect between the player and the character. And I mean, role-playing is definitely the bridge between those two things, between the character and the player. And, that could make people uncomfortable as well. Kaya, how have you led a session 0 or been a part of one?
I actually had a session 0 just 2 days ago with the rest of the Twice Bitten folks. For our upcoming Frostbitten campaign, where we are going to play Rime of the Frost Maiden.
Oh,
and
excellent!
Awesome.
Then you are the perfect person to answer my next question. So, how would you use session 0 to establish kind of an etiquette or expectations when it comes to role playing?
It's difficult because even before the session 0, when you're choosing your players, ideally you're going to be choosing people who are approximately on the same level as you in terms of enthusiasm for roleplay, understanding of how considerate you need to be to other people while you're roleplaying. But that isn't always feasible. And so it seems kind of weird to be trying to spell all of that out in the middle of session 0, but it is really important. Even before anybody starts making their character or thinking about character concepts, you have to set down things like, are we going to be making our characters like a cohesive unit? Are we going to start them all out as, completely different people and have to share the spotlight going around to each of them? How much are we going to think about, okay, now we're going to have our dramatic moment, big self-sacrifice in the middle of combat, or are we going to focus on, getting through combat strategically and quickly? Lots of difficult things to pin down, even during the session 0, and lots of things that I feel are going to end up changing throughout the course of the campaign anyway. So.
Yeah, and those, those are last week on It's About GM Time. It was all about session 0. And one of the things that we talked about was the importance of actually holding several session 0s, or kind of as an ongoing thing. That was not just something that happened at the beginning of a campaign, but you do check-ins throughout the adventure, and one of those things would definitely be to talk about the role-playing part of things, because you are going to have, if you check any kind of Facebook group, or I think it was Todd found a Reddit post the other day that clearly these things were not talked about in the group ahead of time, and it was starting to fall apart for them. So getting those kind of expectations, like, gives people a chance to say, like, do I need to come up with a funny voice for my character? And, you as a group would talk about that. So how are you going to do this? Do I need to describe everything they're going to do? Once again, you'd figure that out, right?
I think a lot of that too is like what you guys are saying is the building the frame from, like, as you as the GM or the DM, it's very important to build that frame of, like, this is what I would like, but you have to get the buy-in from everybody else, because if everybody else isn't okay with that, if they're like, I'm really bad at voices, I don't want to do that, and they're not bought into that, then you either adjust your frame or you be kind of a jerk and say, then get out of my group. Not that you would ever actually do that, but, it's, you're like, maybe once in a while. But you'd have to create that frame for your group, and they're looking to you as the leader. And then I feel like also having someone in the group that is a really good role player, or that is just a really strong personality, helps really well to pull other people through. But having that frame at the beginning of almost like an agreement, verbal, I don't think it's a good idea to write a contract for your players. I've seen DMs do that, and that's like that is an interesting choice. But yeah, at the beginning, having that.
Yeah, I mean, if that works for the group, that's great, kind of thing. But I think that the point that the idea of, like, raising the bar, I think if in your group you have at least one person to kind of show the other people how it's easy, how it can be done, etc. They don't have to be experienced players. It just might be a little bit more to their personality. You'll be amazed at how other people kind of come along for the ride. And they'll try out that, accent one time, or they'll describe something, and hopefully the reaction at the table is positive, and then they want to try it again. And I think that comes down to the idea of, this is a fun and safe activity for all of us. We all get to be a part of it, and we're all trying something different. How do you think that role-playing benefits the game? I mean, it's a bit of a silly question, because it's pretty integral to the game. It's called a role-playing, tabletop role-playing game, for Pete's sake, right? So, you can't, it's kind of built into it, but how do you feel that it benefits you when you are the DM? John, go ahead.
The benefit of it is seeing the engagement that the players get when they start to role play. If they're really buying into their characters and buying into the situation that they're in, if you're running Strahd, you can really lay on to the gothic horror or the intensity of the area that they're in. Or if you're, doing a train heist sequence, which we did in one of my games not too long ago, they really bought into the, oh my god, we could mess this up, we could fall off the train. It just adds an extra layer and makes the role seem so much more important than just, I'm going to pick this lock. It's like, oh, I need to do this right now.
It raises the stakes a lot. I agree 100% with that, because if you're not going to step into somebody else's shoes for a little while and play as the heroic, gladiator type character, then it does become just like, you might as well go play like Monopoly. It's not.
But I get to role play as a little shoe.
If you really want to, you can role play.
My name is Stampy. My name is Stampy, and I like
Monopoly could be more violent than D&D.
Real life violence, though.
Yeah. I mean, that battleship is pretty pointy.
But like she was saying, like I think of like comparing like D&D and Pathfinder and whatever other games you want to play out there to like something like the Diablo games. Like, I played that back in the early 2000s and whatnot with Diablo 2, and it starts off so you're like, okay, this is a really cool story. I'm going to be the necromancer or whatever, and you start leveling up and whatnot, but at some point, the game becomes, okay, I need to know the percentages for how often these items drop on these bosses, and you're not worried about the story anymore. And so that, like the other people were saying, it's like the buy-in from like, I'm treating this person as a person, and their story matters, and it's going to be, I'm going to make them the hero, and with the rest of the team, of course. If you're playing as I am the protagonist, you're going to come off as a jerk. But if you're playing as we are the protagonists, it creates something more than simply gold grinding.
And
Go ahead, Kara.
And to spring off of that, you don't even have to be protagonists or protagonist-like or heroic at all. The entire premise of Twice Bitten, which is where I, play through Curse of Strahd rules as written, is that you can have a bunch of people who are cowards and jerks and traumatized, and they have to go through this thing. And that's really not an experience that you can have without the role-playing aspect, because without the role-playing aspect, you're basically trying to optimize your way through a set of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you can really end up inhabiting people with 3 dimensions and end up having a very different story than just, can we come out the other side and be winners? And you can have a whole bevy of other narrative arcs to go through.
It's the difference between the player wants to do this, but my character would do that. And ultimately, almost every time my character would do that is going to be way more interesting for what happens next in the story than I, as the player, will do this.
I was going to say that I thought I was going to throw shade on D&D tonight because I play Pathfinder, but I'm actually going to do the opposite really quick. Something that I find very, very common in Pathfinder, because the 2nd edition is so very rules heavy, and there's rules for everything, it becomes a very min-max situation where every character, it's like, well, you have one way to build them so that they're optimal, and then you can kill all the bad guys. And a lot of people that play Pathfinder are losing that role play aspect that makes it so beautiful. And as a GM for that, I love the rules because it gives me a frame that I don't have to guess. I don't have to be like, well, okay, maybe you would have gotten that, sure. And it takes a little weight off of my shoulders, so I really like it from that perspective. But my husband and I, we are super RP heavy. And he's not as comfortable with it, and I kind of have to poke and prod him and be like, we're going that way. Come on, let's go.
You play in a two-person situation, so the idea
it's just me and my husband.
Right. Whereas I think for myself, most of the groups I play, there's 4 or 5 players, and what I found is all I need is that one player, and then everyone will kind of try it out too. But on a one-on-one, that element is kind of not there as much. It's a different dynamic.
It's a very different dynamic.
Yeah. What I love about, let's say, the Curse of Strahd campaign that I've been DMing for is that whole thing of how the characters have changed the story and how their backgrounds have become integral to the story, to the point where, I as a DM can kind of pick and choose from their backgrounds and bring up something that then is a, cataclysmic plot hook that they're like, oh no, not that, that kind of thing. And discovering things about their past. I mean, they give me background stories, but then I've gone through and said, actually, this right here, I'm actually going to make it this. It's still this, but I'm doing this with it. And you're not going to know that until it starts to unravel right at you, kind of thing. Which is all part of the role-playing part. It's all about becoming the character. And so let's say your group doesn't have that person to kind of lead by example. Then as a dungeon master, how do you lead by example? What kinds of things do you do to draw it out of your players? Kaya, go ahead. How do you as the dungeon master draw it out of them?
So, couple different things. I actually really like to do individual roleplay sessions with my players before we start the campaign. So, in conjunction with a whole bunch of other things that I do to build out their backstory with them, I will say, hey, you wrote about this NPC that's really meaningful to your character. Do you want to just hop back in time and roleplay out, like over text, a scene that happened between that NPC and your character? It helps them really get into their character's mindset. It builds up some real weight behind that bond. And then, of course, I can bring that NPC into the campaign later, and there will already be a ton of just emotional weight behind that. In addition, use your NPCs. Use your NPCs all the time. They are going to help so much. I'm sure we're going to be talking about NPCs a lot tonight, so...
Yeah, I right away was reminded of a moment where I had texted each player a dream that they had, as you have these kind of creepy dreams in the Strahd campaign. And 3 out of 4 players texted back, oh no, okay, thanks, kind of thing. But the 4th player, he texted back, okay, my character is doing this now. And all of a sudden, this dream that I was kind of sending to him became an interactive back and forth that we were playing it out. I mean, so that was just a beautiful moment of role-playing that he even took that extra step. And out of the 4 of them at the table, he was definitely the most hesitant role player when we started. So that was like a leap forward kind of thing for our group almost, even though the 3 of them were not, they did not experience it at all. It was just between him and I. And it was a really fun moment. What about the rest of you? What are ways that you lead by example? What are things that you do to draw it out of them?
Well, I've never been afraid of making myself look like a fool in public spaces. And so, when I was in like 5th grade, I was like supposed to be miming, doing a harmonica with a bunch of other people. And I'm the only one who's like literally throwing my body around for it. So when I'm running a game, I will do stupid things. Like in I only run homebrew because I'll use things from modules. I just don't like running them. But I brought in a brain in a jar in my campaign in this dungeon, and my characters were going through the dungeon, and they're like, okay, there's a like they found this like mosaic on the floor that shows like a brain. They're like, okay, this is gonna be bad. This is gonna be weird. They go in there, and this brain in a jar has been secluded for 1,000 years, and her name is Lady Gale. And so to be stupid for them, I had her have gone mad. Her wisdom is 3. And so to go with that, she's had no one to interact with or anything like that. So I bring up my pitch a little bit and I speak as fast as I can as she's like telepathically communicating with them. And so I sound a little bit like this, and she goes like this, and she talks really fast about all these arcana things, and blah, 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 blah. And when I first did that, they all kind of went, what just happened? And now she's a beloved character that the half-orc barbarian carries around on his back. And they are currently in the process of researching a way to give her a body back. But, like, doing that, like, it was a big, like, motion forward for a number of them that weren't as comfortable with that sort of thing.
So you put yourself in a situation that you have to do that voice all the time now?
Regularly, not all the time. There's a difference.
At one point, you're kind of hoping that they might kill her off?
No. It's just at some point they're going to end up leaving her behind.
It's almost a little bit like leave them wanting more. There are a couple of NPCs that I have in my campaigns that my players love it when they pop up. The NPCs that are with them for long periods of time, they start to get really annoyed by. But the ones that show up every now and then, because I think as Kai was saying, they have a little more weight and a little more like, oh, if this person's here, there's something important about to happen. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sunless Citadel intro campaign. That's how it started as Strahd, because these were all new players. I find Sunless Citadel is a really good way to get kind of all here's how you explore, here's how diplomacy works, traps, etc., dungeon crawling, etc. So I took the Kobold Meepo from Sunless Citadel, and he's kind of popped up in the Curse of Strahd every now and then. And the characters, or the players, are totally intrigued. Like, how is Meepo here, kind of thing. And
how did Meepo survive?
And you know what? That's one of those answers that as a DM I would say, you don't know. And really, I don't know. And it doesn't matter. He's there. How do you deal with it? Kind of thing.
Meepo is Strahd in disguise.
Maybe.
Oh, snap!
Yeah.
I'm sorry for any of your players who may be watching. Sorry to spoil.
That would be a pretty great thing to do, to put Meepo as Strahd. The Curse of Meepo. Be very, very different campaign. I lost my dragon. Yeah, and I think I find too that, with the NPCs, making sure you find an opportunity to kind of show those flaws and some of their unique characteristics, things like that, those are all hooks. And what a better way to make that happen than to, like, play it out, as opposed to say, oh, by the way, this guy is always scratching his face whenever you talk about gold, kind of thing. And he looks shifty-eyed. Like, as opposed to, whenever they talk about gold, you, as DM, do like this, and you're kind of shifty-eyed. And the players are hopefully going to start to notice that a little bit.
I had an NPC that I've created specifically to help bring my husband along in one way, because he's a really good role player. I talk about it like he's awful. He's actually not. He's really, really good. And he has been studying a German accent so that he can do an accent really well. And it's really cute because I I learned German in college for my opera career or opera degree, and so when he asks me questions, like I'll correct him, and I'm like, no, it's actually like this. But I created a character that's actually going to take him in a very different direction because he plays very emotionless. And I don't know if you guys like. I just play with my husband, so when all the issues that I am talking about are like with him specifically. I don't think he's watching tonight. If he is, I love you, babe. But this character is designed specifically to bring him emotionally forward. And his character makes sense to be kind of a blank slate. He was a slave and stuff, so he's very emotionally damaged, so he hides who he is, but I've created someone that is going to help. And I think in terms of role play with NPCs, if you have something that's going to be a catalyst to prompt more role play, if you have like, I don't know, like, best example I can think of right now is Gilmore from Critical Role. So like him or hate him, or like or hate the show, like I feel like that his character, his NPC, prompted a lot of RP between all of the characters, which was great.
Thank you. Good points. So now we're gonna transition, but it's not much of a transition because the five of us in preparation for tonight's show, we all kind of jotted down ways in which we try to encourage role playing at our own tables. We've got a lot of stuff here. We're not going to be able to get through it all. Okay, maybe in the DVD outtakes kind of thing, it'll be in there. So look for that on a shelf in Walmart someday, maybe. But I do want to cover it because the four of these people, so that was a really awkward sentence. The four of you have got down a lot of really great ideas. John, I want to start with you. Can you share one of your ideas?
One thing that I do is when they do make solid RP progression, make sure that it's rewarded in game. So if they're making a persuasion check to get past a guard, and if they're doing it in character and they're making a persuasive point that makes sense with the story, then I'm going to bring that DC down a little bit, make it a little bit easier for them to get by because they're making that valid point. And, sometimes I'll acknowledge that after session, or I'll tell them, hey, you make a really good point, roll that with advantage. Anything to reward that, it kind of encourages it and pushes it along, makes them feel like less out of place for doing their RP and more like, hey, that's exactly what you should do.
Yeah, and that's kind of what in D&D, what inspiration points are designed for. But my players never use their inspiration points. So that might be a whole other show that we have to explore.
What is wrong with that?
I know, but that might be another show that we have to explore. What are alternatives to inspiration points? I don't think we have time for it tonight, but I love the idea of like, you did that really well, advantage, or lowering the DC that makes sense as well. One thing that I've found that's really helpful is I make sure that I refer to the player as the character name, with the character name, that when there are things that I need from the character, I will talk about the character. And in return, my players, when they are asking me a question, they always say, Dungeon Master, do I, need to blah, blah, that kind of thing. And then when we're on a break, I'm no longer called Dungeon Master. Although I wouldn't mind it. It kind of gets to your head maybe a little bit. I don't know. And so I find that being consistent about, I'm going to talk about your character as your character. That is like first person almost. That is who you are when we are playing this game, as opposed to you are playing this character is just the character. What do they do? Let's go. Kaya, I'm interested in your idea of how you take the character backstory. I think we talked about a little bit, but I want to give you a chance to explore that a bit more.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I have only ever run for players who love to roleplay. I know that this is going to be a very different discussion if you have players who really just want to roll dice and smash things. But for those who are at least a little interested in role-playing, at least a little interested in getting invested in the story in some way, it's kind of, it is a very, very powerful and very to take whatever details your players hand you in their backstories and tie them into the overall campaign in some way. But something else that you might not think to do is you can do that the opposite way too. You can look at things you know are going to be coming up in the campaign, especially if you're running a published module, but even if you're homebrewing. And you can see there's going to be this quest hook coming up, 2/3 of the way through the module. It's going to be 9 months from now. Let's just bring that forward and say in advance, oh yeah, by the way, you're playing the paladin. By the way, you also have a mentor who disappeared three weeks ago. Ask me whatever questions you like. I'll give you a little bit of info, but then keep that in the back of their head for a while, and as the story goes on, then you get the payoff. You don't have to wait for the players to hand you opportunities like that. And obviously don't change their backstory entirely. That's just kind of a jerk thing to do. But adding little bits and pieces, giving players little mysteries to think about, I found is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, anytime that you can, I've said it so many times on this show, the idea that the characters are so integral to the story that life would be going on without them, but this story would not be happening without them. And I think it's important for players to get that feeling that, like, my characters are integral to what is happening. Just like in any good work of fiction, right? Take that character out of that story, and really would that story be even happening without that person's quirks or personality, etc.
Yeah. I kind of like what you're saying, Kaya, about that. There's particularly exciting things that you can take from backstories and twist them a little bit, where there might have been, for what I'm planning, and I'm not going to say what, because there's just the two of us. I do have things from my husband's backstory that are going to be coming up in our story arc that is slightly twisted from what he might remember or his character might remember. And, there are traumatic things that happened when his character was a child that he has assumptions on that may not necessarily be true. Things like that I think you can take their backstory and without changing anything, you give a different facet to what actually happened or how something is going to happen in the future, being identified by that. And I'm so excited about that I kind of have forgotten large swaths of the story arc that I need to write, because I'm so excited about getting to some of this other stuff. Like, I play the scene out in my head and I'm like, it's not going to turn out anything like that, because I know it won't. But
the power of recontextualization is staggering if you put some thought into it, and you can pull it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it'll always, in our head, as someone who's performed music for many years, the audience is always way more forgiving than the performer. So, even when you go into something thinking it's not going to be as good, that's your own filter. Don't let that filter stop you, because for the audience, they're going to be blown away by it, right? Sorry, Todd, go ahead.
I was going to say, I like that Kaya used the word recontextualization, because and that works for all sorts of things, not only particular story beats or anything like that, but in the character creation. In the game that I run on Friday nights, I have a guy who wanted to play a Mark of Shadow Elf, but we're not in Eberron. Dragon marks make no sense. But I was like, okay, I can see this. No, this works. Because instead of he's, dragon marked or something like that, he's marked by basically the ancient big bad evil guy from my campaign world. And so now he's like, okay, we've got this mark, we need to figure out how to work with it, and people are interested in you. except that I didn't even tell him that people were interested in him first. I told other characters that they had to protect the marked one and that sort of thing. And so it was like, oh, okay, yeah. Meanwhile, this is all the big bad evil guys sort of playing games with them in the background. And so that, like, taking something that's one of the players wants to play, and I don't want to say no, but I have to figure out a way to say yes and, or yes but.
Yeah, and I think last week, one of the panelists, Mana Queen, she talked about how every session she starts by giving a role-playing prompt. So she'll ask a question, and so she's gathered all these prompts, and as her players know that these are on the table, there are things that they tell her about their characters that she can then integrate and use in the story, without them saying, "Whoa, you can't do anything with that. You gave it to me. I'm going to use it." One of the other panelists talked about what's called knife theory, as in you have created these beautiful knives that I get to backstab you with. You've given me the knife that I get to take you down with, kind of thing. And I mean, that's all about how you bring that character out of the player.
It's the classic writer's trick of Chekhov's gun. You don't introduce a gun in the first chapter and then not ever have it go off. It must go off by the last chapter.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good way to put it too.
You don't ever want to introduce anything unless you have plans for it, even if it never comes to fruition.
Extra points if you can turn it into a Chekhov's machine gun. Like, don't just have it go off once, please.
Right. Have it backfire too. That's the other.
Yeah.
The whole Chekhov's gun, and then utilizing their backstory. My bard in my homebrew campaign chose the haunted one background and left a really vague mention of a very vague deal and never denoted what it was. I was like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" She said, "Yeah." So, I think my girlfriend hates me now because it's her that did that, but. It's definitely messing with the campaign and really pushing the RP on them too.
I mean, she literally asked for it at that point. She only has herself to blame.
Yeah, and I've heard of players that just basically give a backstory of like 3 points. I was born in this place, and I grew up in this trade, and I'm going on adventuring because of something tragic, and then hands it to the DM and says, "Go have fun." So they want to discover it at the same time, which I think would be so fantastic as a player. That would be horrific as a GM.
Yeah.
I would hate that.
Yeah.
I'd be like, no. Go do your own homework. I'm not doing your work for you.
I'm of a different mind. If any of my players came to me and said, "I want to have amnesia and I don't remember anything from before 2 years ago," a la Molly Mott from Critical Role Season 2, or Campaign 2.
I was about to say,
Yeah. Like, that's like, okay, this is me getting to be a player for a little bit, and I'm going to write this big thing up, and there's going to be 50,000 words that you'll find out 1 word per week. Nice. And that's how it's going to be. And along with that, actually, sometimes you'll have players who just aren't writers. And so they only know how to give you these, like, very basic points and that sort of thing. So I had a player who was like, okay, here's what I have. And then me, as a person who loves writing, comes back as like, okay, I took what you said and I made a story out of it. And so, like, you gave me the outline, I gave you paragraphs. And so I had to do that with at least 2 of my players I can think of off the top of my head, where it's like, okay, you're just not this type of person. I get that. I wish you were, because I want you to write this stuff because I think it's fun and I don't understand why you're not having my fun. But at the same time, I understand that, and so give me what you have, and I will bring it back to you. And I ask for approval. I'm not like, okay, you gave me this, I'm giving you this, you deal with it now. I'm like, you gave me this, I give you this, what do you think? How do I change it? Was there something that I misunderstood? That sort of thing.
You know, I think on a really basic level too, like taking that idea of, I've had players where they'll say, well, I go to the wizard and I tell him, here, I need your staff. I'm like, okay, so what do you say to the wizard? Oh, and just kind of getting them through that practice of, instead of telling me what you say it, and kind of take that leap. The layers of how you would say it, or if you would have an accent, or if you would do this, that can all come. That all depends on levels of experience or the player's kind of comfortability, etc. But at least we can get to that point of just say it as the character would, right? Which I think helps them to take that leap.
And I also think that there's a lot of emphasis put on the players writing a backstory and how good their backstory is. But ultimately, the backstory is there to do two things: to give like life contexts to what the character might want and things like that, and to inform the character psychology. And it's really the psychology that the player is going to be leaning on a lot going forward into the game. You can have a player that writes a really elaborate, like 100-page backstory. I have read 100-page backstories before, but they have no real relevance to what the player is actually doing in the campaign. So, the backstory is great, but it's, a supportive tool for what the PC is going to be doing in the campaign.
Yeah, it's only as useful as it is informing the actions of today. And if it's not useful up to that point, then there's no point in having it there.
Yeah, I like that word that you said, Kaya, the psychology of the character, because I think that's such an important piece of it. That this is in D&D they talk about the flaws and the ideals. And the psychology is kind of the tool that you use that makes this character who they are. Those are those layers that make it fun and memorable, and possibly lead to story too, which is the ultimate ideal, right? Like, I want this character to mean something to the story.
I think in the discussion that we've had today, the one thought that I've had was asking of questions to your players, of like how, where, what happened, what did they do? Like, if you're asking prodding questions, I guess, instead of just yes or no questions, it makes a big difference. My husband really likes to describe how he's casting a spell, and he and I have had multiple discussions on the fact that he wants to be very literal with the verbal and the somatic types of spell casting. And so if he ever forgets to describe a new spell that he's never done before, I'm like, well, how does that feel? And what actions are you doing? And how is it affecting the other characters? Things like that. And that always prompts him to be like, oh yeah, sorry, so I do this and I do this. And sometimes he comes up with stuff on the fly that's brilliant. And sometimes it's not so brilliant, but it still gets him to move and to work with us. And we're also very lucky in the fact that we practice our stuff here at home. We don't ever do campaign storyline or anything like that, but we'll do encounters and we'll practice interacting with each other and how to maneuver when it's just the two of us and I'm doing a bunch of voices for NPCs and I'm getting better at flipping through them. But like, how do we do that? Because we're really weird. But yeah, asking questions is a really, really good one if you've got a player who's stuck.
Well, and that question of how does it feel, I know that from, as I was saying, 20 years of teaching writing to kids, that is the part they neglect the most, which can make their stories and their writing immensely better. It's fun to play a game. It's a lot more fun when your players are emotionally invested in playing a game. They will look forward to a session. They will want to find out the answer to blank when it means something to the character. And so that idea of how does it feel? What does your character feel about this? It's such a huge and important question to ask.
And with that, I've been watching High Rollers, Erois recently, and something that I've noticed, Mark Hulme's, however you say his name, the Dungeon Master, he does regularly is if one of the players is sort of standoffish in a scenario, he will actually directly ask, "Hey, what is Sentry thinking right now?" Not asking them to like trying to bring them into the scene physically or have them speak out or anything like that, giving them an opportunity to have an internal monologue so that the character can feel even if the other characters never see it.
I think a lot of DMs who are trying to elicit roleplay, especially from new players, go the route of asking, specifically calling on somebody and asking, what is your character doing? How is your character feeling? And I think that you should, when you're doing that, follow up on that. Don't just have the player, think of something, being panicked, say something, and then watch their DM just sort of move along, because that gets pretty discouraging. I think that having NPCs pick up the conversational thread, encouraging other PCs to kind of stoke the flames, pick up the conversation and keep going, really lets these new or tentative players know that they've done something. It is encouraged. They've done the right thing. It's safe to sort of come out of your shell more.
Yeah, that goes back to John's point earlier, the idea of rewarding good role play. And maybe it's not a reward that we typically think of like an inspiration point, but I think, Kai, your point is awesome, that the reward is that I, as a DM, am going to use what you've just given me and make it, get that ball rolling and use it to affect the session, the campaign, etc.
Or even just, you get a little bit of limelight, and that's how you hook him, That's how you make him want to crave more of this.
Using an NPC's behavior to kind of bring that out in them. For example, I have a character my party went to. It's a 3-day festival. I wanted them to just kind of goof off, have some fun, because it's a very high stress, very high stakes campaign. They met a guy that's an alcoholic, that's a druid, that thinks he's a wizard, and just him acting a fool in the shenanigans he got up to, the party ended up having a blast. I think they've had more fun with this than anything else I've done in the campaign, because they bought into it so heavily for that same reason.
I feel like we could talk about this idea for a long time. It's definitely such a rich topic, and like I said, it's so integral to the game that it does warrant a lot of discussion. But thank you to the four of you for bringing the ideas that you've had, the experiences that you've had to the discussion. I hope you all have a good night. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Thanks to the panelists, and I hope to see you again soon. And until next session, may all your 20s be nat. All right. Good night, everybody.